Title: The Flames of Ethiopia, a Nation Torn by War. Chapter 1: The Rise of Shadows. The morning sun painted the highlands of Ethiopia in hues of gold and crimson. In the small town of Dessie, Tesfaye Mekonnen, a 62-year-old farmer, stood on his porch, breathing in the crisp mountain air. Life had never been easy, but it was predictable. That predictability, however, was about to shatter. Whispers of war had been growing louder in the villages. The long-standing tensions between the Derg, the ruling military junta, and the Eritrean and Tigrayan rebels had reached a boiling point. The once mighty Ethiopian Empire had fallen in 1974, and with it, the old order. In its place stood a brutal dictatorship led by Mengistu Haile Mariam, a man whose grip on power was as ruthless as it was unyielding. Tesfaye's son, Bekele, a university student in Addis Ababa, had been missing for weeks. His last letter spoke of protests, of students being gunned down in the streets, and of whispers of rebellion growing into roars. Then, silence. On a cold night in November 1977, Tesfaye's worst fears materialized. Soldiers stormed the village, dragging young men from their homes. Under the infamous Red Terror, thousands had already been executed, their bodies left in the gutters of the capital as warnings. Tesfaye tried to fight when they took his nephew, but a rifle to the face sent him sprawling to the ground. He lay in the dirt as the soldiers disappeared into the night, his world now stained with blood and grief. The next morning, the villagers awoke to find their community transformed. Silence hung over them, like a curse. The market stalls stood empty, houses bore the scars of gunfire, and mourning women cried for their lost sons. Tesfaye walked through the remnants of his once thriving town, feeling the weight of history pressing down upon him. The war had arrived, and it would not leave quietly. Chapter 2: War on the Doorstep. By 1980, the war had engulfed the country. The Eritrean People's Liberation Front, EPLF, and the Tigray People's Liberation Front, TPLF, had become formidable forces, fighting for autonomy and independence. The Soviet-backed Derg regime retaliated with indiscriminate bombings, village massacres, and forced conscription. Tesfaye's once peaceful life crumbled into survival. His crops withered, his livestock stolen by hungry soldiers. The war had reached his doorstep. When government troops demanded food, he gave them what little he had left. But when the rebels came days later, accusing him of collaboration, he was beaten and left for dead. With nothing left, he fled to the mountains, joining countless other displaced families. The journey to safety was brutal. Disease, starvation, and ambushes claimed thousands. Along the way, he witnessed horrors that would haunt him forever. Children wandering alone, their parents gone. Young boys recruited at gunpoint. Mass graves dug hastily by survivors too weak to dig deep. It was in the refugee camp in Sudan that Tesfaye found Bekele. He was no longer the bright-eyed student, but a hardened rebel fighter. The son who once studied medicine was now carrying a rifle, his hands stained not with ink, but with war. Bekele's transformation had been inevitable. He spoke of watching his comrades executed, of learning to kill, of choosing between life and death in the battlefield. The father and son reunion was bittersweet, for war had robbed them of the chance to be family again. Tesfaye, once proud of his son's education, now feared he would die holding a weapon rather than a book. Chapter 3: Famine and the World's Gaze. A year that would forever be remembered. A year of death, of starvation, of a silent genocide. The Great Ethiopian Famine swept across the land, exacerbated by war and government policies. Entire villages perished, fields turned to dust, and rivers ran dry. International aid was slow to come. The world watched in horror as skeletal children with sunken eyes appeared on television screens. The West sent food, but Mengistu's forces blocked shipments to rebel-held areas, using starvation as a weapon. In the camp, Tesfaye watched children die by the dozens each day. There was not enough food, not enough medicine. When Bekele arrived, he was gaunt and feverish, his strength fading. He spoke of the TPLF's growing power, of an eventual march to Addis Ababa, of a dream that the Derg would fall. But Tesfaye had seen too much to believe in dreams anymore. One evening, he held the hand of a starving orphan girl as she took her final breath. That moment solidified in his heart what war truly meant. Not battles, not political ideologies, but human suffering beyond comprehension. Chapter 4. The Fall of a Tyrant. By 1991, the tides had turned. The Soviet Union had collapsed, leaving the Derg regime isolated and vulnerable. The rebels, now united under the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, EPRDF, launched their final offensive. In May, Mengistu fled the country. Addis Ababa fell to the rebels, and the streets erupted in celebration and bloodshed. Those who had oppressed for years now faced swift justice. Executions, trials, and revenge killings spread like wildfire. Tesfaye returned home, but his village was unrecognizable. His wife had died in his absence, his neighbors were gone. The scars of war ran deep in the land and in his soul. Bekele, now a commander in the new government forces, was a hero to some and a war criminal to others. Bekele stood at the edge of the village, staring at the sky. The war was over, but the battle inside him raged on. He had fought for freedom, but what did freedom truly mean? Chapter 5. A Nation Still at War. Ethiopia had overthrown a dictator, but peace was fleeting. In the years that followed, the country plunged into new conflicts, border wars with Eritrea, ethnic tensions, and political struggles. The ghosts of the Civil War refused to be buried. Bekele, now older and weary, found himself once again fighting, not for liberation, but for power. His father, now an old man, watched from the sidelines, knowing that the cycle had not been broken. The Ethiopian Civil War had ended, but Ethiopia's war was far from over. Epilogue. The Price of War. As Tesfaye looked at his son, he saw a reflection of himself, someone who had lost more than he had gained. He had survived war, famine, and exile, but at what cost? The land that had raised him was no longer the land he knew. The war had not only taken lives, it had taken souls. Bekele stood at the edge of their village, looking at the sunrise. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to hope, even if it was a fragile hope. Perhaps one day, Ethiopia would know peace. Final thoughts. This is the tragic and powerful story of Ethiopia's civil war, a tale of a nation torn apart by ideology, starvation, and violence. It is a war that reshaped a country, toppled a dictator, and left millions searching for a peace that remains elusive. Let me know if you'd like any further expansions or modifications. Rock it! If you like this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and become a part of our community. Here, you'll find historical wars, inspiring stories, and unique content based on real events. If you want to see more engaging and fact-based stories, hit the bell icon to get notified about our latest videos instantly. Your support means the world to us. Leave a comment and let us know what topics you'd like us to cover next. Raising hands fire. Bell subscribe, share, and help us bring these incredible stories to the world.